The bell had not rung properly in 11 years, and everyone in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, had simply learned to live with its broken voice. Everyone, that is, except the man who climbed up every spring to fix it. Belle Wallace heard him before she saw him. She was standing at the base of the First Calvary Church on a warm April morning in 1884, her basket of fresh wildflowers hanging from the crook of her arm, when the sound of boots against old wooden rungs drifted down from somewhere above her. She stepped back, tilting her face upward into the pale Kansas sky, and watched as a man descended the exterior ladder of the bell tower with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had done this many times before and trusted nothing about it. He was tall. Even folded against the ladder, she could see that. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn canvas work jacket the color of dry earth, and his dark hair was pushed back from his forehead by the wind. A leather tool belt cinched his waist, and the tools inside it clinked softly against each other with every rung he cleared. He moved without hurry, without performance, just a man doing a thing that needed doing. Belle had lived in Caldwell Creek her whole life, 24 years of it, and she could not recall ever seeing this man before. She would have remembered. He hit the ground and turned, and that was when he saw her standing there watching him. He did not startle. He just looked at her with steady brown eyes that were darker than she expected and held something in them she could not name right away, something like distance, something that had learned to keep itself at a careful remove from things. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even, like the string of a guitar that had been tuned past its usual pitch, strung tighter than it ought to be. "Morning," Belle said. She looked up at the bell tower, then back at him. "Did you fix it?" He pulled a cloth from the back pocket of his trousers and wiped his hands. "Should ring clean now." The clapper was cracked at the base. Replaced the suspension mechanism too. It was pulling hard to the left, which is why it sounded the way it did. "Like a sick cow," Belle said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. "That's one way to put it." Inside the church, she could hear the congregation beginning to stir, the low murmur of voices settling into pews, the organ beginning its preliminary scales. Sunday service would start in minutes. "Are you coming in?" she asked. It seemed natural to ask. He was standing right there. Something shifted in his expression then, a pulling away, as though she had touched something he preferred not to have touched. He picked up a worn leather saddlebag from the ground near the foot of the ladder and slung it over one shoulder. "No," he said, "I don't stay for service." "You fix the bell, but you don't stay," she said, and she did not mean it as a challenge, only as an observation, but he looked at her like she had cracked something open that he needed to close again quickly. "That's right," he said. He tipped his hat, an honest and simple gesture, and walked away toward the hitching post at the side of the road, where a dark bay horse stood waiting with all the patience of a creature that understood its person well. Belle watched him go. She stood there holding her wildflowers in the April morning, with the sound of the organ behind her, and the steady retreat of his boot heels on the dry clay road, and she felt something tug in her chest that she could not explain and did not at first try to. She went inside. She set the wildflowers in their vase by the altar. She sat in her usual pew between old Mrs. Harding and her nephew Franklin, and when the bell rang at the start of the service, it rang out clean and clear across the flat Kansas plain, as bright and true as a new coin, and the whole congregation looked up at the ceiling with something like wonder, and Belle looked toward the door. He was gone. She asked Reverend Caldwell after service, catching him on the church steps while the congregation scattered into the warm morning. "Who is the man who fixes the bell? The man with the dark hair and the tool belt?" Reverend Caldwell had a round, sun-browned face that always wore an expression of gentle patience, and he turned it toward her now. "That's Isaac Slater," he said. "He comes every spring. Has done for, I'd say 7 or 8 years now, since before you came back from your schooling in Wichita." He paused, looking out down the road. "Good man, skilled with mechanical things. He doesn't take payment, which I've tried to change and which he won't hear of." "Where does he come from?" Reverend Caldwell thought about this. He has a homestead about 12 miles east near the Salt Fork River, keeps to himself mostly. The Reverend paused, and there was something careful in the pause. He went through some hard things. A while back, he keeps to himself. Belle said, "What kind of hard things?" "That's his to tell, not mine," the Reverend said, kindly but firmly. She nodded and thanked him and walked home along the main street of Caldwell Creek, with the spring wind lifting the hem of her dress and the clean ring of the fixed bell still echoing somewhere at the back of her mind. Caldwell Creek in 1884 was a town in steady flux. The cattle drives that had made it famous a decade before, when it had sat on the Kishom Trail, and the drovers had come up from Texas in their thousands, filling the saloons and the streets with a wild kind of life. Those days had largely passed. The railroad had changed things. The farmers had come in with their fences and their plows, and now the town was something different than it had been. Quieter, more settled, still rough around its edges but reaching, tentatively, toward something more permanent. Belle's father, Thomas Wallace, ran the dry goods store on the main street, a two-story building with a wide front porch where men sat on warm evenings and talked about land prices and water rights and the best way to sink a well. Belle had grown up in that store, helping her father stock shelves, learning to keep the accounts in the ledger book with the green cover, sweeping the porch every morning before the town woke up. She had gone to Wichita at 19 for 2 years of schooling and had come back at 21 with better handwriting, a trunk full of books, and a quiet kind of confidence that had surprised some of the town's older residents, who had expected her to return smaller than she'd left. She was not small. She never had been, in any of the ways that mattered. She had dark blonde hair that went lighter in the summer and that she wore pinned up in the mornings for work and let down in the evenings when she walked. She had gray eyes that people sometimes called blue and sometimes called green depending on the light and her mood, and a way of looking at things directly that some people in Caldwell Creek found unsettling and that she had long since stopped apologizing for. She was not looking for a man, particularly. There had been a man in Wichita, a schoolteacher named Gerald Whitmore, and he had been kind and decent and wholly wrong for her in ways that had taken her almost a year to properly understand. There had been a rancher's son here in Caldwell Creek named Dale Patterson, who had courted her for 6 months with great enthusiasm and considerably less self-awareness. And that had ended on a warm evening in August when he had told her that she would need to stop keeping the accounts once they were married, because it wasn't proper for a wife to know more about numbers than her husband. And Belle had looked at him across the table at her father's kitchen and said, very clearly, that she thought they would not suit each other after all, so she was not looking. But she was 24 years old and she was not blind, and Isaac Slater's steady dark eyes and the way he had moved down that ladder careful, certain, unperforming, had left a mark on her morning that she carried through the week. It was her father who gave her the opening, though he did not know it. On the following Wednesday, Thomas Wallace came into the back room of the store where Belle was tallying the week's receipts and sat down heavily in the chair across from her. He was 61, her father, with white hair and a bad knee that had been getting worse since winter, and a stubborn disposition that extended to his own health. "I need someone to look at the mill mechanism on the grain storage," he said. "The gear is slipping again. Franklin Harding says there's a man named Slater out near the Salt Fork who does good mechanical work." Belle looked up from the ledger. Isaac Slater. Her father looked at her with the sharp attentiveness of a man who had raised a daughter alone since her mother died and had learned to read the slight variations in her voice. "You know him. I met him. Briefly. He fixed the church bell on Sunday. Will you ride out and ask him? My knee won't make the trip, and I don't want to send a message boy for something this particular." She told her father she would go on Friday, when the morning rush in the store had settled. She spent Thursday not thinking about it, which meant she spent Thursday thinking about it constantly, which was an experience she found simultaneously irritating and privately illuminating, because she was not, as previously established, a woman who gave her attention to things that did not merit it, and the fact that it kept going there told her something. Friday morning broke clear and warm, the kind of early spring day in Kansas that felt like a promise after the hard gray of winter. Belle saddled her own horse, a steady roan mare named Clara, and set out east on the road that followed the curve of the creek before branching off toward the Salt Fork. The homestead was 12 miles east, as the Reverend had said, and she found it without much difficulty. A solid timber house set back from the river in a stand of cottonwood trees, a good-sized barn in better repair than the house, a corral with 3 horses in it, a kitchen garden that had been recently turned and planted with straight, careful rows. Everything about it spoke of a man who attended to the practical with great seriousness and the decorative not at all. She tied Clara at the post near the gate and walked up the path. There was the sound of metal on metal from inside the open barn door, a rhythmic clinking that paused when she stepped onto the swept dirt yard. He came to the barn door, and she registered that he was taller than she had remembered, with the sleeves of his shirt rolled to the elbow and a smear of grease along one forearm. He recognized her. She could see it in the brief alteration of his expression, the small shift from wariness to something more considered. "Miss Wallace," he said. She blinked. "You remember my name." "I asked the Reverend." She absorbed this. "You asked the Reverend my name." He said nothing to that, only watched her with those even brown eyes, and she had the sudden clear sense that he was a man who regretted having said the thing he'd just said, not because it was untrue but because he'd said it out loud when he hadn't meant to. "My father sent me," she said, because it was true and because she was not going to pretend otherwise. "He has a grain mill with a slipping gear, and Franklin Harding told him you do good mechanical work." "I do," Isaac said, simple, without vanity. "Could you come and look at it?" He was quiet for a moment in the way she would come to know as characteristic of him, not hesitation exactly but a kind of internal assessment, something being weighed. "Next Tuesday," he said. "I've got a fence to finish before the week's end." "Tuesday is fine." She glanced toward the barn where the sound of his work still seemed to hang in the air. "What are you working on?" He looked at her steadily, and then, as if making a decision, he said, "Come see." She followed him into the barn. On the workbench lay what appeared to be a broken section of a water pump, disassembled into its components with the same deliberate care she'd seen in the placement of each item. He had a drawing on a piece of paper beside it, a precise mechanical diagram that she could see he'd made himself. "Water pump for a widow woman named Mrs. Elkins," he said. "Her well pump gave out 2 weeks ago. She's been hauling water from the creek by hand." "That's a long haul," Belle said. "It is." She looked at the drawing. "Are you charging her?" He gave her a look that answered the question without words. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, with the spring light coming through the high window and the smell of horses and hay and machine oil around her, and she said, "You fix the church bell for free, and you fix widow women's water pumps for free. The church bell is in exchange for using the Reverend's workshop in the winter months," he said. "It's a fair arrangement. And Mrs. Elkins, she brought my mother apple preserves every fall for 10 years, he said. "My mother died 3 winters ago." The simplicity of it, the completeness of his accounting, the sense that every debt he acknowledged was one he intended to honor in full, it struck her somewhere she did not expect to be struck, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "I'm sorry about your mother." He nodded once. His jaw moved slightly, a small muscular shift, the only visible evidence of something felt. "Tuesday," he said, and it was not unkind, just a returning to the matter at hand. "Tuesday," she agreed, and she walked back to her horse. She rode home with the sun bright on the flat plain, and the cottonwood trees along the Salt Fork catching the breeze, and she thought about the mechanical diagram on the workbench, and the smear of grease on his forearm, and the way he'd said my mother died 3 winters ago, with the careful precision of a man who had learned that certain kinds of pain needed to be spoken plainly or not at all. He came on Tuesday as promised, arriving at the Wallace store in the middle of the morning with his saddlebag and his tool belt and his dark bay horse. Belle's father met him on the porch and shook his hand and led him to the grain storage behind the main building, and Belle watched from the window of the store for longer than was strictly necessary before she found something else to do. Isaac spent 2 hours with the mill mechanism. She brought him water at noon, and he thanked her without looking up from the gearwork, and she stood in the doorway long enough to watch his hands moving over the machinery with a sureness that was almost beautiful before she went back inside. He was done before 2 o'clock. He found her father in the store and described what he'd done in the same spare, exact way he had described the Belle repairs. The gear had worn unevenly on one face. He'd reseated it and added a shim to correct the alignment. It would need replacing properly within the year, and here were the specifications if her father wanted to order the part from the supplier in Wichita. Her father paid him what he asked, which was modest, and offered him coffee, and Isaac accepted, which surprised Belle slightly. She put the pot on the kitchen stove and the three of them sat at the table, and her father asked Isaac about the land near the Salt Fork, and Isaac answered in his measured way, and Belle sat across from him with her coffee cup and found herself noticing the way he listened, the absolute quality of his attention when her father spoke, as though what was being said mattered and deserved to be treated as though it mattered. It was a small thing, but it was not nothing. He left in the early afternoon, riding east, and her father watched him go from the porch and then came back inside and said, "Good man," in the tone he reserved for things he had considered carefully. "Yes," Belle said and went back to her accounts. Spring moved into May and May into June, and Caldwell Creek warmed and settled into its summer rhythms. The morning market, the afternoon heat that drove most people indoors until 4 o'clock, the long amber evenings on the porch. Belle kept the store accounts, rode out to visit Mrs. Harding on Thursdays, attended church on Sundays, helped her father with the spring inventory. She saw Isaac Slater on 3 separate occasions in those weeks, all of them unremarkable in their circumstances, and none of them unremarkable in their effect on her. The first was at the general store on a Monday morning in May when they both happened to reach for the same bolt of leather at the supply counter, and their hands came within an inch of each other, and neither of them pulled back immediately. He was buying a length of it for some repair. She was buying a shorter piece for her father's saddle straps. They stood at the counter together, while Tom Briggs, the supply clerk, cut both lengths and made awkward conversation about the dryness of the spring. Isaac said to her quietly while Tom's back was turned, "How is your father's knee?" She looked at him. "You remembered that. You mentioned it when you came to ask about the mill." She had mentioned it in passing, briefly. "It's better," she said. "He's using a walking stick now, which he resisted for 3 months and which I consider a personal victory." Something moved in his eyes, not quite the smile but nearer to it than before. "Congratulations," he said. The second occasion was at the 4th of July celebration in the town square, where half of Caldwell Creek gathered to eat potato salad and watch the children run races and argue about whether the town council should fund a new schoolhouse. Belle was standing with her friend Nora Briggs, Tom's wife, watching the foot races, when she saw Isaac at the far edge of the square. He was standing near the fence alone, not participating in any of the festivities but not exactly absent from them either, just watching with that quality of careful attention that seemed to be his natural mode of being in the world. Nora said, "Who is that?" in the speculative tone she used when she was about to say something pointed. "Isaac Slater," Belle said. "The man who fixes things," Nora said, nodding, "among other descriptions." Nora looked at her sideways. "You know him?" "Somewhat." "He's looking over here." "Nora." "I'm only observing," Nora said, entirely unapologetically. Belle did not look over. But later, when the celebration was winding down and families were gathering their blankets and their sleepy children, she crossed the square to where he had been standing, because she had found that she intended to, and she was not a woman who pretended she hadn't intended things. He was still there, though the crowd around him had mostly cleared away. He had a tin cup of something, coffee most likely, and he was watching the last of the day's light go out of the western sky. "You didn't enter the shooting contest," she said. He looked at her. "No, you don't seem like a man who wouldn't do well in a shooting contest. Doing well at something isn't always a reason to enter it," he said. She considered this. What is a reason to enter it? He thought for a moment, and she watched him think, watched the unhurried way he turned a question over before answering it. "Wanting to," he said. "I didn't want to." "What did you want to do?" she asked, and she kept her voice light because she was genuinely curious and genuinely light about it, and because she was not, as previously noted, a woman who played games with the things she actually meant. He looked at her for a long moment. The last of the evening light was doing something to his face that she chose not to analyze too carefully. "Stand here," he said finally. "Watch the sunset. It was a good one." "It was," she agreed, and they stood there together in the emptying square while the sky went from orange to rose to the deep blue that precedes dark, and neither of them said anything more, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Belle had ever stood inside. The third occasion was accidental in the purest sense. She was riding home from Mrs. Harding's on a Thursday afternoon in late June when Clara threw a shoe on the road about 3 miles outside town. Belle dismounted and assessed the situation with the practical eye of a woman who had ridden horses her whole life, and concluded that she would have to walk the horse home, which was inconvenient but manageable. She had been walking for about 20 minutes when Isaac's bay horse came around the bend at an easy canter and stopped when its rider saw her. He swung down from the saddle. He looked at Clara's hoof and then at Belle. "Going to be a long walk," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "I have a spare shoe in my saddlebag. I can fix it here if you hold her steady." She looked at him. "You carry a spare horseshoe." "I carry things that might be needed," he said, already opening the saddlebag. He worked on the side of the road in the afternoon sun while Belle held Clara's head and talked quietly to the horse, and she watched his hands again, that same quality of sureness she'd noticed in the barn, each movement economical and correct, nothing wasted. He had a small portable kit, a hammer and nails and the shoe, and within 15 minutes Clara was reshod as neatly as if they'd been in a proper smithy. He stood and dusted his hands on his trousers. The sun was at his back and Belle had to shade her eyes to look up at him, which gave the moment an odd intensity she felt in her breastbone. "Thank you," she said. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "Isaac," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw the effect of it, the slight change in his expression, a fractional opening. "You have to let people give you something." He looked at her for a long moment. The road was empty in both directions. The grass on either side moved in the hot afternoon wind. "Have supper with me," he said. The words came out with a kind of surprised precision, as though he had not known he was going to say them until they were already out and he did not retract them. Belle looked at him steadily. "When?" "Saturday evening." "All right," she said. "Saturday evening." He gave a single nod, as though they had agreed to a business arrangement, which made her smile as she rode home, because the smile was pulled out of her and she did not try to suppress it. She wore the blue dress on Saturday, not the pale blue one she wore to church, which was perfectly respectable and which she thought of as her public self, but the darker blue one with the small white flowers at the collar that she had bought in Wichita, and that made her gray eyes look definitively blue. She told her father she was having supper with someone, and her father looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression that she had spent 24 years learning to interpret and said, "Have a good evening, Belle," and went back to his book. Isaac came to collect her at 6 o'clock on a light wagon. He had changed his clothes, she noticed, a clean dark shirt and his better boots, and his hair was brushed back from his forehead. He handed her up to the wagon seat with a formal care that charmed her, and they drove east out of town as the sky began its evening display. He had set up supper on a flat stretch of ground near the Salt Fork, just outside the cottonwoods. A cloth on the ground, real dishes rather than tin, bread and cold roasted chicken and fresh cheese, and a glass jar of sweetened lemon water. The river moved nearby with its quiet June sound. The cottonwood leaves made their own small conversation in the wind. She said, You went to a great deal of trouble. I wanted to, he said, and the echo of their conversation at the 4th of July celebration was deliberate. She could see that, and it made something warm move through her chest. They ate and talked, and this was where Belle began to understand Isaac Slater at a different depth, because the man who sat with her by the salt fork as the evening came on was not silent in the way she had initially understood. He was quiet, yes, but he was quiet the way a deep well is quiet, not empty but contained, and when he opened up he was startlingly, genuinely, completely there. He told her about the homestead, about the years he'd spent drifting between towns doing mechanical work before he settled at the Salt Fork. He told her about his father, who had been a blacksmith in Missouri, and about learning the trade of fixing things from a man who had believed that being useful was the nearest thing to virtue he knew. She told him about Wichita and the schooling and the books she'd read there that had rearranged her thinking. She told him about the accounting ledger with the green cover that she'd kept since she was 12 years old, and how the numbers had always made a particular kind of sense to her, the way they held honest records of things, the way they didn't lie. They can be made to lie, he said. By the person holding the pen, she said. Yes, but the numbers themselves are honest. It's the people you have to watch. He looked at her in the dimming light. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? I'm not sure, he said. Something easier to put away. The honesty of it struck her like the clear ring of a properly tuned bell. She held his gaze. Is that a problem for you? He was quiet for a moment that stretched like a road going somewhere she couldn't yet see. No, he said. I don't think it is. They did not touch that evening. They sat 3 feet apart on the cloth by the river and talked until the stars came out fully and the lemon water was gone, and he drove her home through the warm dark with the wagon wheels making their steady sound on the road, and said good night at her father's gate with the same careful formality he had shown at the beginning. But she went upstairs to her room that night with a feeling in her chest like the bell ringing on a clear morning, clean and carrying, going out across the plain. The summer unfolded with a quality she would later think of as inevitability, though at the time it felt like every day was a new and particular surprise. Isaac rode into town on Saturdays and they fell into the habit of walking together in the evenings, down the main street and out to the edge of town where the land opened up and the sky went enormous. They talked about everything: the town's politics, the question of the new schoolhouse, the railroad's effect on the local cattle trade, her father's knee, his fence repairs, a book she'd lent him about mechanical engineering that he read and returned with careful notations in the margins. She liked the notations. She liked them very much. She kept the book. He was not uncomplicated. She understood this more clearly as the weeks passed. There was something in him that had learned stillness through difficulty rather than through ease, a quality of guardedness that was not coldness but had the look of it if you didn't know how to read it. She was beginning to know how to read it. She asked him one evening in August, when they were sitting on the bench outside the hardware store after the sun had gone down and the street was cooling. The Reverend said you went through hard things. A while back. He was silent for a count of several breaths. She waited because she had learned that his silences were not avoidance, they were process. I had a wife, he said. Her name was Catherine. She died of fever 6 years ago. We had been married 2 years. Belle said nothing. She sat very still. There was a daughter, he said. She was born early. She died the same week as Catherine. The weight of it settled around them in the summer dark. Belle felt her throat tighten. She did not fill the space with words because there was nothing to fill it with, and she understood that he was not asking her to fill it, only to be present in it with him. After a long moment, she said, "What was the daughter's name?" He looked at her and something in his face shifted deeply, the way ground shifts when a river finally finds the right channel. Anna, he said. Anna, she repeated softly. Nobody ever asks that, he said. It matters, she said. He looked at her for a long, still moment. The street was quiet around them. A lamp burned in the window of the dry goods store across the road. It matters, he agreed, and his voice carried something she had not heard in it before, a rawness, a gratitude for the simplicity of being understood. She did not reach for his hand, not that night. But she sat closer to him on the bench, and he did not move away, and the evening continued around them with its ordinary sounds, and it was not ordinary at all. She told her father about Catherine and Anna, not because she felt she should report such things, but because she and her father had always talked honestly about the important things, and her father listened with his reading glasses on his knee and then said, "A man who loved his wife and his child and lost them both and is still standing, that's not something small, Belle." "No," she said, "it's not." Her father studied her for a moment. "Do you love him?" She was surprised by the directness of the question, though she should not have been, since directness was a family trait. "I think I'm heading toward it," she said carefully. "I don't want to move faster than the thing itself moves." Her father nodded. "Don't move slower than it either," he said, and went back to his book. She thought about that for several days. What changed things was not a dramatic moment but a quiet one, which felt appropriate. It was an evening in September, when the first cool air had come down from the north, and the cottonwood leaves along the creek had begun their turn, going yellow at the edges before the full gold of fall. She and Isaac were walking on the south road out of town, their usual route, and he had been telling her about a dispute he'd heard about between two neighboring homesteaders over a water diversion, and he stopped mid-sentence and turned to her. "I think about you," he said. "When I'm working, when I'm not working, I think about you a great deal, and I believe you should know that." The directness of it took her breath. She stopped walking. He was looking at her with those steady brown eyes that had nothing performing in them, nothing strategic, only the plain truth of what he had said. His hands were at his sides. He was braced for something, she could see that, some answer he was not certain of. She stepped forward and put her hand against the side of his face, feeling the roughness of the day's growth against her palm, and she said, "I think about you too, Isaac. I have been thinking about you since you came down that ladder in April." He closed his eyes for a moment. A long breath left him, as though something held for a very long time had finally been released. When he opened his eyes, he covered her hand with his, pressing it gently against his cheek, and he said, "Belle," just her name. But the way he said it was a whole sentence. She kissed him first, because she had always moved toward what she wanted rather than away from it, and the kiss was quiet and certain, like the river, like the bell on a clear morning, like everything about them that had been moving steadily toward this point since April. He kissed her back with a gentleness that went straight through her, and then with something less gentle and considerably more honest. And when they stood apart there was the sound of the wind in the dry grass and the distant light of the town and the whole enormous Kansas sky above them, and she had never felt more completely herself. He held her hand walking back to town, and he did not let go until her father's gate, and he said good night with a warmth in his eyes that was new and not new at once, as though it had always been there and was only now permitted to show. Fall came in properly then, the great Kansas fall with its gold light and its cold nights and its sense of culmination. Isaac rode into town most Saturdays and stayed for supper with Belle and her father, and Thomas Wallace welcomed him at the table with the undemonstrative warmth that was his version of great affection. Isaac brought things. Firewood he'd split, once a repaired clock that had been sitting broken on the mantel for 2 years, once a length of prime salt pork from a trade he'd made. Her father accepted these things with equal undemonstrativeness, and the men found in each other a comfortable respect that had little need for excess words. Belle watched them together and felt a tenderness that nearly undid her. She rode out to Isaac's homestead on a Saturday in October, her first time back since the spring, and he showed her the property properly this time. The barn, where 3 horses stood in their stalls and where his workbench was a landscape of purposeful order, the kitchen garden, now harvested and turned for winter, and the house itself. The house was clean and spare, as she had expected. It was also, she noticed, quietly sad in the way of houses that had been prepared for a life that did not arrive. There were 2 rooms that had clearly been intended for different purposes than they currently served. One of them now just a storage room, with a small window she could see had been given a curtain at some point, and then the curtain taken down. She did not ask about the curtain. She filed it away with the careful attention she gave to all things that told the truth about him. In the kitchen, he made coffee and they sat at the table, and she looked around the room at the plain shelves and the iron stove and the single photograph on the wall, a formal portrait of a young man and woman in their best clothes with the stiff expression of daguerreotype subjects. "Your parents?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She looked at the woman who had Isaac's brow and something of his steadiness in the eyes. "She looks kind," Belle said. "She was," he said. She put her coffee cup down and looked at him directly. "Isaac, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly." He waited. "Are you afraid," she asked, "of this, of what's between us? Not because you don't want it, but because you've had things before and lost them." The muscle in his jaw moved. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwoods and the horses shifted in the barn. "Yes," he said. "Me too," she said. "Not in the same way and for different reasons, but yes." "What are your reasons?" he asked, and she heard in it the same thing she had felt when she asked about Anna's name, the gratitude for being asked, for being included in the asking. "That I will give too much of myself," she said honestly. "That I've done that before, given so much attention to understanding someone that I forgot to stay as I am. I don't want to lose myself in being good at loving you." He absorbed this. He was quiet in that deep-well way. Then he said, "I don't want you to, either. I want you exactly as you are. The accounts ledger and the books with the annotations and the way you ask the questions nobody else asks. I want all of it." She felt her eyes sting, which surprised her, because she was not generally a woman who cried easily. "Then I think," she said, "that we are doing this." "We are," he agreed. They were. November brought the first frosts and the news that the town council had approved funding for the new schoolhouse, which prompted a celebration at the church hall that most of Caldwell Creek attended, bringing pie and opinions in roughly equal measure. Belle attended with her father and Isaac came with them, and this was the first time the town saw them together as something definite, a fact that traveled through the hall in the particular way that small-town facts travel, quickly and with commentary. Nora Briggs materialized at Belle's elbow within 15 minutes. "I notice that Isaac Slater is standing next to you as though he intends to keep standing next to you indefinitely," Nora said. "Your powers of observation are remarkable," Belle said. "Belle Wallace." Nora's voice was warm with happiness. "Good, I am glad." "Thank you, Nora. He fixed our pump last August, did I tell you? Tom's back had gone out and the pump was a disaster. Isaac came and didn't say more than 12 words the entire time, but the pump works perfectly and he wouldn't take a cent. And I told Tom that a man who just comes and fixes things without needing a great deal of conversation about himself is a man to be valued. "That is one of the better descriptions of him I've heard," Belle said. Across the hall, Isaac was talking with Reverend Caldwell and her father, and he caught her eye over the Reverend's shoulder, and the corner of his mouth moved in that particular way, and she felt it all the way across the room. Winter came down hard in January of 1885, the kind of Kansas winter that was all gray sky and bone-cold wind, and the roads between town and the Salt Fork became difficult often enough that Isaac's Saturday visits were sometimes delayed by weather, which made them more valuable when they happened. He stayed longer on those visits, often through Sunday morning, sleeping in the spare room above the store, and they established a habit of Sunday mornings at the kitchen table with coffee and her books and his newspaper, a quiet domestic rhythm that Belle found she loved with an uncomplicated fullness. He was reading a piece about the spread of the railroad south and west, and she was annotating the margins of a book about land survey laws, which she was reading because of a question she had had about the town's water rights, and for perhaps half an hour neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were the wind against the window and the distant movement of her father getting up and starting his own morning. Isaac said, "I've been thinking about adding onto the house." She did not look up from her book. "Onto which side?" A pause. "The east side. There's good light there in the morning." She looked up now. He was looking at his newspaper with the slightly careful focus of a man who had said something that meant more than it said. "That would be a good location," she said. He put the newspaper down and looked at her. "Belle, Isaac, I would like to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said, and she was not breathless about it. She was steady and warm and certain, the way the river is certain of its direction. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I have been thinking about it since August, and I am certain of it, and I know this is not a conventional way of asking, but I don't have a different way, and I think you know that by now." She set her book down. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the winter light with his hands flat on the newspaper, and his eyes holding everything he had not said and everything he had, all the steady accumulation of the months since April, the bell and the ladder and the river supper and Anna's name and the October kitchen and every Saturday in between. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Isaac Slater." He exhaled. The kind of exhale that is not relief but arrival. He came around the table and she stood, and he took her face in both his hands the way she had first touched his face on the South Road in September, and kissed her with great care and great feeling. And her father, who had been standing in the doorway of the kitchen for approximately 30 seconds with his coffee cup, cleared his throat and said, "About time," and went back to his room. They told Nora and Tom Briggs that afternoon, and Nora cried, which she denied, and Reverend Caldwell on Sunday morning with a warmth that made his round face shine. The town received the news with the general goodwill of a community that had watched something develop and was pleased to see it arrive at its proper destination. They set the wedding for April. Belle thought it was right, April, the month of the bell and the ladder and the beginning, and when she told Isaac this he looked at her with the full warmth of his expression, the version she had come to know as the truest version, and said, "April." There was one difficulty, one real one, and it came in February. Belle was at the dry goods store when she overheard a conversation between two men she knew only slightly, ranchers from the eastern edge of the county, who were discussing, with the careless confidence of men who have not considered whether they are being heard, the land situation near the Salt Fork. One of them said something about a competing claim on a portion of Isaac's property, a claim that had apparently been filed in Dodge City by a man named Garrett Hennessy, who had been dealing in disputed land titles across the county. She went directly home and asked her father if he knew about this. He did, a little, and what he knew was not good. Garrett Hennessy was a land speculator who had been operating in the region for several years, using technical irregularities in original homestead filings to establish competing claims on settled property. He had already displaced 2 families on the eastern side of the county, and the legal process was expensive and slow. Belle sat with this information for exactly 1 evening before she told Isaac on Saturday. She told him plainly, without softening it, because he was a man who deserved plain truth and who was not well served by cushioning. He listened without interrupting. His face went very still in the way it went still when he was keeping something contained. She finished, he said, "I know about Hennessy." "What do you know?" "He filed the claim 3 months ago. I've been dealing with it." His jaw tightened. "I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want this to be the thing we were occupied with." "Isaac," she said, with the particular patience and firmness she reserved for moments when he defaulted to managing alone, "we are getting married in April. There is no part of your life that you are managing alone anymore. That is what getting married means." He looked at her. Something in his expression went through several stages, and on the other side of all of them was something open and genuine. "I know," he said. "I know that. I'm still learning it." "Learn faster," she said, not unkindly. What followed was several weeks of effort that Belle found, once she understood the situation fully, to be more soluble than it had initially appeared. The issue was a technical one in the original land filing, a minor inaccuracy in the survey documentation that Hennessy was exploiting. Belle, who had been reading about land survey law in her own time, and who had a thorough acquaintance with the county records by virtue of her father's business, spent 3 evenings at the county office in Caldwell Creek, going through the filings with a precision that impressed the county clerk, who was not easily impressed. She found what she needed on the 3rd evening, a secondary survey document from 1876 that correctly recorded the boundaries and that predated Hennessy's claim, filed under a reference number that had been incorrectly indexed and therefore missed in the initial search. The document was clear and unambiguous. The land was Isaac's, had always been Isaac's, and Hennessy's claim had no legal basis. She brought the document to the county office on a Wednesday morning with a letter she had written herself, clearly laying out the legal situation, and the county clerk forwarded it to the district office in Dodge City. By early March, Hennessy's claim had been formally dismissed. She told Isaac over supper at his kitchen table and showed him the documentation, and he read through it twice carefully before he looked up at her. "You did this," he said. "The document was always there," she said. "It just needed to be found." "Belle," he set down the papers, "you need to understand something." "Tell me," she said. "I have been accustomed to handling my own things," he said carefully. "I have been good at it. But what you have done here is something I would not have done because I would not have known how to look for it, and I would have found another way, a harder way, and I might have lost the land anyway." "You might have," she said. "I need you to know," he said, "that I understand what that means, that I understand what you are and what you bring, and that I am not a man who will fail to see it." It was the most words he had said in one stretch that she could recall, and she felt every one of them. "I know you're not," she said. "That's one of the reasons I said yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned hers over and held his, and the lamp burned between them, and outside, the March wind moved over the flat land, and the river sounded its constant note. April arrived, as it always did in Kansas, with sudden warmth and the smell of new grass, and a sky of that particular wide blue that felt like a beginning. Belle was up early on the morning of the 15th, which was a Sunday, and was the day they had chosen because it was Reverend Caldwell's suggestion that a Sunday wedding use the church to its full purpose. She dressed in the room above the store, with Nora beside her arranging the pins in her hair and crying again, which she continued to deny. Belle wore a dress she and her mother's older sister had made together, ivory cotton with small tucks at the bodice and a gathered skirt, simple in a way that was exactly right for a woman who did not like things performed at her. She wore her mother's small pearl earrings, which her father had brought out of the box in his wardrobe the previous evening with a care that made her throat tight. "You look like her," her father said, when she came downstairs. He said it quietly, and she kissed his cheek, and they stood in the kitchen for a moment, just the two of them and the early April light through the window and everything that was about to change and everything that would not change, and it was enough. Isaac was at the church when she arrived, standing at the front with Reverend Caldwell and Tom Briggs, who was standing up with him. He wore a clean dark coat she hadn't seen before, and his hair was brushed, and he was holding his hat in both hands in front of him. And when he turned and saw her coming up the aisle of the small church with her father beside her, his face did the thing that only her presence could do to it, that complete, unguarded opening, as if she were the thing he had been most careful about, and was now choosing not to be careful about, choosing to let it be fully seen. She reached him at the altar, and her father placed her hand in Isaac's, and Isaac's hand closed around hers with a gentleness and certainty that she would remember for the rest of her life. Reverend Caldwell spoke the words. They said their own, and Isaac's were plain and true in the way she had expected and loved him for. "I will be honest with you. I will see you clearly. I will be here." Belle's were plain too, because she had thought about them carefully and discarded the formal options in favor of the true ones. "I will bring my whole self to this. I will not make myself smaller. I will love you with everything I have." The bell rang at the end of the service. clear and bright, and carrying across the spring morning of Caldwell Creek. And this time the man who had fixed it was inside the church to hear it ring. And when the sound washed over the congregation, Belle looked up at the ceiling and then at her husband and saw that he was looking at the ceiling too. Listening to the bell, he had given back its voice. And then he looked down at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she loved, and she put her face against his shoulder briefly, feeling him solid and warm and real. And this was better than she had known to hope for, and she let herself have it completely. The celebration that followed was held in the church hall, and most of Caldwell Creek came, because a wedding in a small town is a communal event of the first order, and because Thomas Wallace's dry goods store had clothed and provisioned half the county, and his daughter's happiness was, in some sense, understood as a shared concern. There was food in abundance, music from a fiddle player named Jake Reese who played reels until his bow arm gave out, dancing that Belle participated in with the full enthusiasm she brought to things she had decided to enjoy, and a great deal of conversation that she did not follow closely because she was more interested in her husband. Her husband. The word had a weight and a rightness that she had not anticipated, and that she was glad to be surprised by. Isaac danced with her twice and stood beside her through the rest of it, and he was not fully comfortable in the crowd. She could see that, but he was present in it, genuinely present, talking with people when they came to him, and accepting the handshakes and the congratulations with a warmth that was real rather than performed. And she watched him move through the evening and felt the specific pride of knowing a person truly and seeing them be exactly themselves. At the end of the evening, he drove her home in the wagon, and then they drove together, not to town but east, because this was the night she was coming to the homestead, to the house he had been adding on to. He had finished the East Side addition in March, 2 new rooms that caught the morning light, and he had asked her in February what she thought the kitchen should have, and she had said more shelves and a second window, and both of those things were there when she walked in with the lamp. She stood in the kitchen of her new home with her husband behind her and the lamp burning on the new shelf in the April dark outside the second window, and she said, "It's good, Isaac." "It's better now," he said. She turned around and looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had fixed things quietly for years without asking for recognition, who had carried a loss that would have unmade a lesser person, who had come down a ladder in April and looked at her with steady dark eyes and walked away, and then asked the Reverend her name, this man who was now her husband and who was looking at her with everything he had. And she crossed the kitchen and took his face in her hands, as she had done on the South Road in September. And this time there was nothing held back and nothing to hold back, and the lamp burned warm, and the Kansas night held the new house in its April dark. And this was the beginning of the rest of everything. The first years of their marriage were good ones, full of the ordinary and the particular. Belle took on the bookkeeping for 3 additional businesses in Caldwell Creek, her reputation for competence having spread through the simple mechanism of her actual competence, and the income she brought added to what Isaac made from his mechanical work, and between the two of them they did well. Her father's knee improved somewhat enough for him to stay on at the store, and he came to supper at the homestead every Sunday, a tradition that required no discussion and no formalization. It simply was. Isaac's work evolved in those years. The region was changing, the old cattle drive economy giving way to more settled farming and growing towns, and there was increasing need for the kind of mechanical knowledge he had, irrigation equipment and mill mechanisms, and the growing complexity of farm machinery. He was not a man who promoted himself, but word traveled on its own, and by 1886 he had more work than he could take on alone. He hired a boy from town, 17-year-old Will Garrison, who was good with his hands and whom Isaac taught with the same spare, direct method that had been used on him. Belle liked Will. He was earnest and clumsy in the way of young men who are good people before they know it about themselves, and he called her Mrs. Slater with enormous formality, and ate supper at the homestead twice a week with the appetite of someone who had not been eating enough. His family, she asked Isaac one evening. Father drinks, Isaac said, simply and without commentary. She served Will larger portions from then on, and one Sunday she sent him home with a wrapped parcel of food with the matter-of-fact casualness that avoided embarrassing him. Isaac watched this and said nothing, and she knew from the way he watched it that he had noticed everything. In the spring of 1886, which was 2 years into their marriage, Belle came to Isaac on a Tuesday morning and said, "I think we might be having a baby." He was at his workbench in the barn, and he turned around with the full attention he gave to important things. He looked at her for a long moment. His face moved through things she could read now, that landscape of his expression that she had spent 2 years learning, the flash of something that was not quite fear, the steadying, the arrival at real feeling. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "Soon." He crossed the barn and took her hands in both of his and held them. His thumbs moved over her knuckles. He looked at her the way the devotional and the terrified look at the same thing at once. "I'm all right," she said, because she could see that he needed to hear it. "I'm healthy and I'm not afraid, and you're going to be a wonderful father." He pulled her into his arms then, with a feeling and completeness that was very particular to him, and she felt him hold on, and she held on back, and they stood in the barn with the horses and the workbench and the April light through the high window, and there was all of it in the holding. Catherine and Anna and grief and loss and the years of being alone and the church bell and the ladder and the south road and the kitchen table, and now this possible new thing, this step forward into something that had only been lost before. "If it's a boy," he said against her hair, "I'd like to name him Thomas, for your father." She felt her eyes fill. "He'll like that," she said. "And if it's a girl," he said, and there was a slight roughness in his voice, "I'd like to name her Anna." She pressed her face against his shoulder. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Isaac." Thomas Isaac Slater was born on a cold morning in January of 1887, healthy and loud, and possessed from his very first moments of an opinion about everything, which he communicated with great vigor. Isaac sat beside Belle through the labor with a steadiness that she would later tell Nora had been the single most important thing, and when Dr. Harmon placed the baby in his arms, Isaac looked down at his son with an expression that Belle would hold in her heart for the rest of her life. The complete, unguarded opening of a person who has been afraid for a very long time and has walked through the fear and found on the other side exactly what they had hoped for. Thomas Wallace, the grandfather, came to the homestead the morning after and held his namesake grandson with hands that shook slightly, and a face that was doing things it usually kept under very good control. He said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "Hello, Thomas," to the baby in a voice that was thick with something, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused seriousness of the newborn. Will Garrison came the same day and stood at the door with his hat in his hands and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Slater, Mr. Slater," and then said to the baby who was asleep, "Hello, little boss," which made Belle laugh out loud. Nora cried, which she again denied. Life at the homestead deepened and enriched with the baby in it. Isaac proved, as Belle had told him he would, a wonderful father, patient, steady, teaching by demonstration in the same way he taught everything, and possessed of a gentleness with his son that was not at odds with his own nature but was, she thought, one of the truest expressions of it. He built Thomas a cradle with the same careful precision he brought to all mechanical things, and it was beautiful in its way, clean-lined and solid and built to last. The church bell came around again the following April, as it always did. Isaac went on Sunday morning with his tool belt and his ladder, and Belle came to the church early and waited at the base of the tower with Thomas in her arms, 5 months old and wide-eyed at the sky. Isaac came down the ladder as she had first seen him come down it, 3 years ago now, with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who trusted the work and not the height. He hit the ground and turned, and there she was with the baby, and his face did the thing. He crossed to her and put his hand on Thomas's back and looked at her over the baby's head with all of it in his eyes, 3 years of it, and she looked back at him with equal fullness. "Does it ring right?" she asked. "It rings right," he said. "Are you coming in for service this year?" He considered this, and she saw him consider it, saw the thing it had always been for him, that standing apart, that long habit of being outside the warmth of the gathered, which had always been more about what he had lost than about what he had believed or not believed. She saw him consider it in the light of what was different now. She watched him come to the thing. "Yes," he said. They went in together, Isaac carrying Thomas because Isaac had discovered he could carry Thomas and do most other things simultaneously, and they sat in the pew together. And when the bell rang to start the service, it rang out clear and full and carrying, as it had every year since he started fixing it. And this year, Isaac Slater sat inside the church and heard it ring, and Belle watched his face when the sound swept through the room, and there was on his face something she had been watching build for 3 years. The expression of a man who has come back from a long way away and found that the place he came back to was worth every mile of the returning. The years that followed were good in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, but held together by the particular strength of people who have chosen each other clearly and kept choosing. The homestead grew with the family. Isaac added another room when it was needed, because he had always built for the life that was actually being lived rather than the life that was merely possible, and the life being lived kept growing. Belle continued her bookkeeping work and expanded it as the town grew, and in 1889 she began keeping accounts for the new schoolhouse board, which brought her into the civic life of the town in a way she found satisfying and Isaac found unsurprising, because he had never had any doubt about what she was capable of, or what she would choose to do with the capability. The schoolhouse was a matter of considerable community effort, and there was a period of several months in 1889 when the funding fell short and the building sat half-finished, which caused a great deal of concern among the families who had already been counting on it. Belle organized a community fundraising effort that involved everyone from the church ladies to the saloon owners, the latter of which required some negotiation, but which she managed with the directness that was her great gift. And the school opened in the fall of 1890 with a small ceremony attended by most of the town. Thomas started school there in 1892 at 5 years old and came home on his first day with paint on his hands, and the report that his teacher Miss Garrity was very kind, but that arithmetic was boring and he preferred science, which made Isaac quiet with amusement and made Belle say, with great sincerity, "Then you will study science." And Thomas nodded with the gravity of a small person who has been taken seriously. In the spring of 1891, Isaac came to Belle in the kitchen one morning and said, "I think we might have another one coming." She looked up from the stove. "You think, or you know?" "I know," he said with the slight note of pride in his perceptiveness that he sometimes allowed himself. She laughed, a full and genuine laugh. "When did you notice?" "3 weeks ago," he said. "You waited 3 weeks to say something. I wanted to be sure he paused, before I let myself feel it." She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on his face as she had done so many times now, and he covered them with his as he always did. "Feel it," she said. "Feel all of it, Isaac. That's what I'm here for." Anna Rose Slater was born in October of 1891, round and dark-haired like her father, and possessed of her mother's direct gaze from the first moment. Isaac held her with a stillness that was very different from the stillness Belle had known at the beginning, a stillness that was not guarded but full, and he said the name quietly to the baby, Anna, as if the saying of it was both a remembering and a releasing, as if the name was large enough to hold both the loss and the love, and Belle held his hand and let him have the whole of the moment. Thomas, who was 4 years old and had been waiting with great impatience for the baby to arrive, came in and looked at his sister with an expression that was equal parts awe and skepticism and said, "She's very small," and Isaac said, "So were you." And Thomas considered this information carefully and then said, I would like to hold her. And so he did, sitting very still on the chair with his father's hands around his, holding his sister with the solemn concentration of someone doing an important job. Thomas Wallace, who was 68 now and whose knee had gotten steadily worse despite the walking stick, came the next morning and sat in the chair by the bed and looked at his granddaughter with the softness of a man who has had enough good years to accumulate a great deal of softness. "Anna," he said, "that's a good name." "We thought so," Belle said, and looked at Isaac, and Isaac looked at her, and the whole history of the name and what it meant moved between them in the way that things move between people who know each other completely. The church bell came every April, and every April now Isaac fixed it and came inside for service, sitting beside Belle in the pew with whichever of the children was at his side, Thomas with his paint-stained hands and his interest in science, Anna with her father's dark eyes and her mother's direct gaze. It became, as things do when they are done with constancy and love, a ritual of the most genuine kind, not performed but inhabited, not remembered but lived. In the spring of 1893, Belle stood at the base of the bell tower again as Isaac came down the ladder, 53 years of him now visible in the economy of movement, in the way the tool belt sat on his hips with the ease of long familiarity, in the gray that had come into his dark hair at the temples, and that she found, if she was honest, almost unreasonably attractive. Thomas was 6, at the age of maximum independent motion, and was already inside the church with Nora Briggs, who had volunteered to contain him. Anna was 18 months and asleep against Belle's shoulder with the complete abandonment of the very young. Isaac hit the ground and turned, and there she was, as she had been the first time and every time since, standing at the base of the church with the April light on her face and the wildflowers in her basket, except that now there was also a sleeping baby against her shoulder, and the sound of her son's voice from inside the church saying something that prompted Nora's answering murmur. He stood and looked at her for a moment. His face was doing the thing she loved, the full open thing, the unguarded version. "Does it ring right?" she asked. It was what she always asked. "It rings right," he said. It was what he always said. She shifted Anna gently to her other shoulder and held out her free hand, and he took it, and they stood for a moment in the April morning with the warmth of the new season on their faces and the whole of Caldwell Creek gathering behind them and the sky of Kansas going enormous and blue above. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. This man who had come down the ladder and walked away and asked the Reverend her name and fixed widow women's water pumps and named his daughter for the child he had lost and learned, slowly and with great effort and great love, to stay inside the warmth of the gathered rather than stand at its edge. "Yes," she said. "Fully and genuinely yes, Isaac." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles in a gesture that was entirely him, private and honest and tender. "Good," he said. From inside the church, Thomas's voice rose in a question that was clearly directed at Nora, and Nora's voice answered with the patience of a woman who had been answering that particular boy's questions for 6 years and had made peace with the volume of them. Anna stirred against Belle's shoulder and made the small sound that preceded waking. "Ready?" Belle asked. "Yes," he said. They went inside. The bell rang to start the service, clear and bright and carrying across the flat spring land of Kansas, out over the creek and the main street and the dry goods store, and the road east toward the Salt Fork and the homestead with its east side addition, and its kitchen with 2 windows. It rang out across the plain where the grass was coming in new and green after the winter, across the land that was Isaac's, fully and legally and finally his, across the whole wide, ordinary, miraculous world that they had made between them. Isaac sat in the pew with his daughter awake now in his lap, and his son pressed against his side and his wife's hand in his, and he listened to the bell he had given back its voice ring over the town that had given him back his own, and the sound of it went on and on and on, as a bell properly fixed will go on, as a good and honest love will go on, beyond the moment of the making, out into everything that comes after. Thomas Wallace sat in the pew behind his daughter and his son-in-law and his grandchildren, and he listened to the bell too, and he thought about the morning his daughter had come home from church in April of 1884 with wildflowers in her basket and something new in her expression. And he thought about a man coming down a ladder and looking at her with steady dark eyes. And he thought that of all the mechanisms in the world, of all the things that needed fixing and the people who fixed them, this had been the finest work he had ever seen. Young Will Garrison, 26 now and running his own small repair business with the skills Isaac had given him, sat in a pew near the back with the girl he was courting, a rancher's daughter named Cecilia, and he held his hat in his lap and listened to the bell, and thought that a man could do worse with his life than learn, from the right person, that the work of repair was the work of love. Nora Briggs sat beside Tom and pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, which she maintained afterward had been entirely due to the dust. Reverend Caldwell spoke his service with the steady warmth of a man who had presided over many things in Caldwell Creek, marriages and funerals and arguments about fence lines and celebrations for new schools, and who knew that what was in his church this April morning was a particular kind of thing, ordinary enough to be true and rare enough to be worth every word of the occasion. And the bell rang on, and the spring moved over the Kansas plain with its ancient indifferent beauty, and in the first pew of the First Calvary Church in Caldwell Creek, Belle Wallace Slater held her husband's hand and her daughter's hand and felt her son's small weight against her side, and knew herself exactly where she had always been heading, here, in this pew, inside this light, beside this man, with the whole of the plain going on beyond the windows and the whole of the future going on beyond that. Full of ordinary days and particular mornings and the honest, necessary work of two people choosing each other, again and again and again, as long as the bell rang and the river moved and the April came.